Before I get into this episode, I just need to say that it's a very emotional subject for me because one of the victims was a family member. And even though I never met him, I feel a special bond for reasons that I could never even begin to express. But if you're like me in the spiritual sense, you'll just get it. My great uncle, Thomas Rance Yarborough, came into the world just 2 days before Christmas in 1880. So, see, I didn't ever know this man. He was born nearly 100 years before I was born. Now, I can't say for sure if he was born in the Honea Path area of South Carolina, but I do know that's where his story ended. And that ended, well, that's what I'm going to tell you about tonight. It's one of those tragedies people don't talk about, but the truth is, it happened, and it's part of our history. Honestly, I wouldn't have even known about it myself if I hadn't been digging into my family tree a few years back. Out of the blue, a cousin of mine emailed me with the details he had uncovered. By then, my grandfather and all of my grandfather's brothers and sisters, which were Thomas's nieces and nephews, had already passed, so I couldn't even ask them about it. And as far as I can remember, they never spoke of it while they were alive. Even the cousin who sent me that email passed away not long after that. And it almost feels like the whole story was intentionally laid to rest with Thomas and the 6 others who were lost that day. I've came across a few documentaries from the 1980s, or at least I think that's when they were made. And in every single one, the people interviewed said the same thing. This was something they were told not to talk about. And the hard truth is, anyone who was actually alive when it happened has more than likely already passed on. What I'm talking about is the massacre that took place back in 1934. If you've ever been through Honea Path, you know it looks like so many of the other little towns scattered across the southeast. There's the remains of an old cotton mill, the kind that used to be the heartbeat of the community, with rows of small houses that once belonged to the mill workers. You'll see a handful of mom and pop shops, a couple of gas stations, more churches than you can count, but nothing at all that would make you think something so dark and tragic ever happened there. Back then, the cotton mills weren't just a place to work. They were the center of life, and not just in the South. For families who were barely scraping by, the mills offered a kind of hope. The whole family could get hired on, even the kids, because they just weren't laws in place yet to stop it. My own grandmother, for example, left school after the 6th grade so she could work in a mill, and that wasn't unusual at all for the time. I've even come across old photos online. Kids who look no older than 5 years old standing at looms working right alongside the adults. People used to say children were hired because their small size let them squeeze into tight and often dangerous spaces that grown-ups just couldn't reach. The conditions in those mills were downright miserable. Imagine being crammed inside a building full of roaring machines, the air thick and stifling, because there was no kind of cooling system at all. The workers put in long, grueling days, sometimes 12 hours or more. And at the end of it, they had almost nothing to show for it. Minimum wage in the 1930s was just like 25 cents an hour. And some mill workers didn't even make that. Most brought home around $4 a week. $4! Even with the cost of living being lower back then, how could anyone stretch that $4 far enough to feed a family, keep a roof over your head, buy clothes, and cover all the needs that come with day-to-day life? It's almost impossible to wrap your head around it. One thing to keep in mind about those days is that in small towns like Honea Path, there was usually one man who seemed to run everything. And in Honea Path, that man was Mr. Dan Beecham. He wore a lot of hats. He was mayor of the town, superintendent of the mill, municipal judge, and a handful of other roles. Now, it's important to note, Beecham didn't actually own the mill. He was more like the plant manager, working for the Hammett family, who really held the reins as owners of the Chicola mills. He wasn't wealthy either, but he carried himself with such authority that people assumed he was born rich and powerful. The truth is, he had come from the same kind of background as the mill workers themselves. He was just another employee, but one who happened to sit in the position of influence. This is where a man named Olin D. Johnson comes into the picture. He was a populist member of the South Carolina House of Representatives, and unlike a lot of politicians of the time, he really seemed to care about the working class folks that he represented. Johnston used his position to hold committee hearings and push the idea that strikes might be the workers' last line of defense against the awful conditions in the mills. He'd eventually go on to become governor of South Carolina and later a U.S. Senator. But before all that, the Great Depression hit, and when it did, things only got worse. Mill owners started demanding longer hours and higher production, but they weren't about to offer a single cent more in pay, so they didn't give these people raises for all that they expected of them. Then in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, and for mill workers, it finally felt like there might be a glimmer of hope. With his New Deal came the National Industrial Recovery Act, and that changed things in a big way, or at least it seemed like it would. The act set a national minimum wage, cut down on those endless long hours, and gave workers the legal right to join unions. For the first time, employees felt like they finally had the tools they needed to take back some control over their lives. At Chicola, the workers would gather around their radios to listen to Roosevelt's fireside chats, and for the first time in a long time, they felt a spark of hope. Some of them even wrote letters straight to the president, laying out the mistreatment they faced at the hands of their employer, and they were pleading for help. Others started joining those unions, and by 1934, nearly 180,000 textile workers had become part of the United Textile Workers of America. At Chicola alone, about half of the workforce had signed on with the union. So technically, workers had the right to unionize, but there was a catch. The board that was in charge of enforcing that law, it was overseen by the mill owners themselves. And let's be real, we already know exactly how they felt about unions. That loophole gave them even more control. They didn't just keep the awful working conditions going. They used their power to intimidate, punish, and even fire anyone who dared to support the union. It was like giving the fox the keys to the hen house. The protests kicked off on September 1st, 1934, which happened to be Labor Day, and that was fitting enough, right? And within just a week, nearly 500,000 workers across the country had walked off their jobs. It was massive. In South Carolina alone, 43,000 people joined in. The mills, they just basically shut down. With no one left to run the machines, everything ground to a halt. It was a moment where workers made themselves impossible to ignore. Mr. Beecham was furious, but the real pressure came from the top. The mill owners weren't just upset, they were panicked. They saw the protest as a direct threat to their business, and they pushed Beecham to hold the line no matter what. Their message was clear: shut it down fast and by any means necessary. So Beecham dug in, ready to go toe-to-toe with the workers, not because he wanted to, but because his bosses demanded it. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Beecham wasn't just the mill superintendent. He basically ran the whole town. Where folks worked, where they worshiped, where their kids played, he had a hand in all of it. If a worker had a problem, Beecham was the one who stepped in, and not always kindly. He even acted as the town's magistrate, handing out fines when someone's drinking got out of line. He ruled with a heavy hand, and personally, I'd call it an abuse of power, but hey, that's just me. One of his favorite tools of control? Mill housing. Just like most mill towns, Chicola owned rows and rows of identical little homes, and they provided the electricity and heat too. So if you lost your job, you didn't just lose your paycheck, you lost your home. Beecham used that threat like keeping dogs on a leash. If you step out of line, you could be evicted with barely a warning. But here's the twist. Now that the workers had unionized, his threats weren't landing the same way. The union was there to protect them from being fired for just speaking up. And knowing the kind of man that Beecham was, you can probably guess what happened next. Especially on day 6 of the strikes. So here's what went down early in the morning on September 6, 1934, around 5 a.m. to be exact. Somewhere between 200 and 300 people gathered outside Chicola Mill, joining a massive strike called by the National Textile Workers Union. This wasn't just a local thing, it was happening at mills all up and down the East Coast. Some of the folks had come in from nearby Belton, part of what they called a flying squadron. And no, there weren't any planes involved. It was just a nickname for groups of workers who traveled from mill to mill, joining picket lines to help shut things down. Now, bigger mills had already gotten a response from the National Guard, but the governor of South Carolina didn't think Chicola needed that kind of backup, at least not yet. Nothing had happened. But Beecham, he wasn't about to wait around. He took matters into his own hands and deputized 126 men, locals and mill workers, all of them staunchly anti-union. He handed out shotguns, pistols, rifles, whatever he could get his hands on. And just to drive the point home, he mounted a World War I machine gun on the roof of the mill. Let that sink in. The protesters themselves weren't armed, not a single weapon among them, but Beecham was gearing up like it was war. And it all spiraled so fast. People inside the mill started passing picker sticks out the windows to the protesters outside, and that set off a wave of panic. Fist fights broke out. Random, chaotic, and then at 7:45 a.m., the shooting began. The machine gun Beecham had mounted on the roof jammed, thank God. But even with that malfunction, 3 minutes later, 7 men were down. 6 died right in there. 1 more passed away at the hospital later. 30 others were wounded, including women. And here's the part that still guts me. Every single one of them had their backs turned. They were running away when they were shot at, retreating, trying to get out. One of the men that was killed that day was my great-great-uncle Thomas. He was 53. That's exactly how old I am now. I've read everything I could find about that day, and every source says the same thing. The machine gun jammed. And honestly, if it hadn't, I don't even want to imagine how much worse it could have been. The wives and kids ran to their husbands and fathers, collapsing beside their bodies in the dirt. Some of those men had been shot 10 times. 10. and they were running away. Can't wrap my head around that. What kind of rage or fear makes someone fire that many bullets into a person who's already retreating? That detail just guts me. I don't even have words for it. They were killed for daring to stand up, for believing they deserved better. Alongside my great-great-uncle Thomas, the lives of Claude Cannon, Lee Crawford, Ira Davis, E.M. Knight, Maxie Peterson, and C.L. Rucker were also taken. Their names are etched into a memorial in Dogwood Park, and across the top it reads, "They died for the rights of the working man." That line hits hard. It's not just a tribute, it's a reminder of what it cost to demand dignity. Now here's the part that still makes my blood boil. Every single church in Honea Path was owned by the Mills, and they refused to let the funerals happen inside of them. Not one. So instead, the families held a mass funeral out in a field just beyond town. People came from everywhere. Labor organizers, religious leaders, folks who'd never even set foot in South Carolina before. And they say over 10,000 people showed up for those funerals. Now, just to be clear, those workers weren't buried in that field. It was just where the funeral ceremony took place. But the message was loud and clear. The mill owners wanted no part in honoring the dead, no apology, no remorse, nothing. Nobody really knows who gave the order to fire that first shot. But I've got my own thoughts on it, but I'll keep those to myself. Because at this point, everyone involved has passed on, and there's no way to prove anything. That said, it's widely believed that Dan Beecham was the one who gave the fire command. Now, after the massacre, warrants were issued for 11 men, 3 Honea Path policemen, and 8 anti-union townspeople. They were all charged with the murders of the 7 mill workers. But get this, the jury took less than 3 hours to deliberate. All 11 of those men were acquitted. Just like that. Those 7 men never saw justice. Witness after witness took the stand, laid out what they saw, and still no one, not one single soul, was held accountable. One of those witnesses said Officer E.T.K. shot my Uncle Thomas with a pump-action shotgun. Another said Uncle Thomas was running away with his hands in the air, when he was hit in the back. 2 people swore they saw Beecham firing a weapon toward the chaos, but Beecham, he claimed he was standing in the doorway of the mill office the whole time, and that's the story he stuck to. If there's any sliver of good that came out of this heartbreak, it's this. The tragedy at Chicola forced people to take a hard look at labor laws. Reforms were made. Protections were strengthened. The system had to reckon with what happened. So maybe, just maybe, those 7 men didn't die for nothing. Their sacrifice lit a fire that couldn't be ignored. If you know me, you know I have to go there. To the places where history cracked open. I need to feel it in my bones. I know it sounds crazy, but I have to, if I can, I have to go to where something happened. And about 10 years ago, I made my way to the old Chicola mill site. And I walked through it, and I probably shouldn't have because it was in really bad shape. But I just had to. But anyway, I walked through it, I walked around it, and even though, it probably wasn't the smartest move, it just kind of gave me this, not closure, you can never get closure, and like I said, I didn't know him. I don't know, it was like this sense of peace just being there, kind of getting this understanding, I guess. But like I said, the building was falling apart, it was barely holding itself together in places, but I just had to be there. Now, as I stepped through, I swear I could hear the machines running. If you've ever lived near a mill, you know what that sounds like. It reminded me of the sound of J.P. Stevens. J.P. Stevens was the one that used to lull me to sleep as a kid. That low, steady rhythm. And in that moment, I could feel it. The exhaustion, the heat, the weight of working long hours for next to nothing. It was August, but the air felt thick with the kind of heat that comes off looms and gears. Maybe that sounds strange, but it's a gift, I guess, and I hold that gift close. It helps me to connect with what those workers live through, their frustration, their fight, their fire. But sadly, y'all, a blaze tore through that mill. It's been a couple of years ago. I meant to have looked into exactly when this fire took place, and I believe there's been several fires, but this last fire, it destroyed even more of what was left. So it's like another layer of history gone. I also made the trip to Uncle Thomas's grave. That visit hit me hard. Found out that his wife Lila had just died 4 days shy of being 3 months before that massacre. On their headstone, there's a stamp, UTW of A, organized November the 19th, 1901. That little engraving means everything. It tells me Uncle Thomas was finally seen as a Union man, as someone who stood up, as someone who mattered. Now, if this story has stirred something in you, and I hope it has, there's more of it to dig into. There's a powerful documentary called The Uprising of 34. And I've had trouble finding a full version to stream, but you can catch like these clips and segments of it on YouTube if you poke around, and if you're more of a book person, I can't recommend Milltown Murder enough. It was written by Frank Beecham. Good Lord, Beecham. And he's actually Dan Beecham's own grandson. Now, I got my copy off of Amazon, but I'm pretty sure there's other places that you can find it too to purchase. And it's worth the read. It's very raw, very revealing, and deeply personal. Because, like I said, that's Dan Beecham's grandson. So whatever happened to Dan Beecham? Well, in the months after the massacre, his health started to slip. Bit by bit, he declined. And in 1936, just 2 years later, he died of heart failure. Quite the end for a man who once held the whole town in his grip. And that's a wrap for tonight and for this season. I saved this story for last because it's close to my heart, and honestly, it's one of my most favorite true crime tales to tell. Thank you for walking with me through the first season of Bloodshed and Breadcrumbs. Your presence, your curiosity, your heart, it means everything. I'll be back in January with a brand new season, so keep an eye out on all the socials that I have for the page for the exact drop date. Until then, stay kind, stay curious, and let your holidays be full of warmth, mischief, and meaning. Take care of each other, and good night.